Alatreon currently is the sole black dragon in Monster Hunter World, a classification for only the most mythical, feared, and lethal monsters. Preceding the encounter with this incredibly powerful dragon, we discover that someone has been trying to keep us ignorant about the presence of this beast by burning old texts, giving us very little information on the dragon itself. Shrouded by mystery, Alatreon is a force to be reckoned with, but with a little insight and a lot of preparation, Alatreon is nothing more than another monster to slay. Alatreon has a very unique mechanic in that it is able to switch between elements. We'll get more into that later, so for right now, let's just focus on what it's weak to in each state. In Fire state, Alatreon is most weak to ice, followed by water. It is immune to fire damage. In Ice state, it is weakest to fire, followed by thunder, and immune to ice. In Dragon state, it is only weak to dragon, but all elements will still do moderate damage. You will want to be focusing on the front legs, head, and tail for doing the most damage while melee, and primarily the head and tail for gunning, keeping in mind that gunners never get 3-star damage on anything, so do try to wound when gunning. The most efficient weapons against Alatreon are strong elemental ones, that is, weapons that do a lot of elemental damage not only based on stats, but also their actual attacks as well. Because of this, Charge Blade and Switch Axe are very good choices if they have the elemental files, since those are very strong elemental attacks. Duels, Insect Glaive, and Sword and Shield are great choices based on their elemental output, and bowguns, not including bow, are fantastic due to their ability to use elemental shots and switch elements with Alatreon. Weapons like Hammer, Gunlance, and Greatsword are going to be at a disadvantage unless you really go all in on element. Kajar weapons with inherent crit element are a nice choice typically, but if you don't have any of those or haven't made a decent elemental weapon yet, a Safi Jiva weapon built for element is a decent place to start. The most obvious answer to Alatreon is full Safi Jiva. Not only do you get a large elemental boost with your weapon drawn, but you also get points into Blight Resistance and the Evade window, two extremely helpful skills in this fight. Overall, however, you'll want to stack elemental damage as much as possible via the elemental of your choice plus 6. Blight Resistance is not negotiable, as Dragon Blight will render your elemental weapon completely useless, and Alatreon literally does every single Blight. The only exception is running 2 Blight Resistance and Coalescence for more elemental damage. Health Boost plus 3 is also a necessity. I say this because you will want the extra padding to survive Alatreon's Eschaton Judgment. Evade Window 3 is extremely helpful, and Part Breaker for breaking the horn is pretty helpful as well. Otherwise, Speed Eating, Recovery Up, and Speed Sharpening are a blessing for this fight, and other defensive skills to keep you constantly fighting can go a long ways. You have a lot of choices for equipment in this fight, but I strongly recommend the Health Booster to tank Alatreon's Judgment, and the Temporal Mantle to help with all wall slams. Other great options are the Vitality Mantle to take most of the damage from his Judgment, or the Evasion Mantle if you don't have any Evade window in your set. As far as items go, be sure to bring Flash Bombs if you can't get a knockdown while it's flying, and do not forget Astera Jerky or Sushi Fish Scales for during Eschaton Judgment. Materials to craft extra Mega Potions are my go-to, and of course, Null Berries if you choose to run Blight Res 2 for when you get Dragon Blight. Do not try to wait for that just to go away. I also recommend any buffs you can bring, such as Demon and Arbor Drugs, as well as Dash Juice. If you're in a group, do not forget Dust of Life either. If you haven't spec'd for Speed Sharpening, Wetfish Fin Pluses are very helpful. Keep in mind, you cannot Farcaster during the fight, so don't bother taking up an item slot with one. Before we get into analyzing Alatreon's attacks and discussing openings for damage, we need to go over how the fight actually works. There are 2 event quests for Alatreon, one where it starts in ice form and the other in fire. You can tell by the description of the quest, but Dawn of the Death Star, it starts in ice, and the Evening Star starts in fire. You can tell what element Alatreon is by the glowing color of its body and horns, as well as the surrounding environment. The most important part of this fight is weakening Alatreon's Eschaton Judgment. You can only do this with elemental damage.
So non-elemental weapons won't be of much use, huh? Hunters, you got that?
No, Patrick, Blast is not an element. Because of this, you will most likely want to start in the opposite element that Alatreon does, i.e. bring a fire weapon if it starts in ice form. Doing enough elemental damage will knock Alatreon down, and the handler will tell you you've weakened its power. This allows you to survive the Judgment. But what happens when Alatreon switches to fire form and you're using a fire weapon? Well, there is no way to weaken the judgment. Fire cannot knock down fire form Alatreon, and the same for ice. You'll have to do enough damage exclusively in Alatreon's dragon form to weaken his judgment. Alatreon will always transition to dragon form before going from ice to fire or fire to ice, and before performing Eschaton Judgment. This is a key moment. You can only break Alatreon's horns in dragon form. Breaking a horn will force Alatreon to return to the form it was in prior to the dragon form following its judgment attack. You may not want to break a horn, however. If you're gunning and have the ability to switch between fire and ice ammo, you can save ammo by letting it switch, seeing as you can't easily get back to camp without a tactical retreat. Also, if you are not running a fire or ice weapon, you can simply focus on doing damage to get an elemental knockdown if you haven't yet, as running a water or thunder or dragon weapon is just as viable to clear Alatreon as a fire or ice, but you may not get the knockdown until the dragon form. Seeing as the head is a difficult target to hit, going for the arms and not a horn break is a good strategy when you still need to hit the elemental damage check. So let's go over the general flow of the fight. Alatreon starts in fire or ice, and then transitions to dragon. If you break a horn here, it will revert to the form it had before the last dragon form after its judgment. If you do not, it will switch to the opposite element. It always performs Eschaton Judgment at the end of dragon form. If you have not gotten an elemental knockdown before this, you are dead. If you have, you can survive it with healing items. Breaking the second horn in the second dragon phase will revert Alatreon back to its starting form again, after an Eschaton Judgment of course. If you have broken both horns already, Alatreon will switch to the opposite element from its starting one following its third Eschaton Judgment. That is, if you haven't killed it yet. Alatreon has plenty of openings during its attacks. You just have to know how to exploit them. Its most common attack is a sporadic thunder strike, seen when Alatreon rears on its hind legs and electrical sparks surround it. To avoid this, simply sit slightly behind and even inside its front legs for the best damage, or just stay underneath Alatreon in general. This is also a decent opportunity to strike its head, but be careful of the thunder strikes on the left and right side. My favorite attack, a circular fire explosion, will hit you very hard, but it's slow and can be exploited easily. Alatreon will stand on its hind legs and charge a fire attack in front of it. Let the inner circle explode, then roll inward to avoid the outer explosions and get an entire combo done on the head. There's another fireball attack that is only a single explosion. Watch for Alatreon to pull itself backwards before shooting a fireball forward. It will always shoot this fireball directly in front of it and out of ways. It has a decent radius, so roll towards Alatreon or to the sides to avoid it, but never away. This is almost always followed up by another ranged attack, usually fire. When Alatreon swings its head side to side and lightning surrounds it, it triggers 2 to 3 electrical strikes in a line targeted at one player. You can just walk to avoid this, and Alatreon is open for attacks the entire time. Alatreon does have a few ranged attacks you should always watch out for. If you see ice forming around its mouth, run to the sides to avoid a particularly painful and widespread ice attack. If you see fire with its head looking forward, move to the side to avoid a strong fire beam. If it pulls its head far back and to the right and holds for a second, run in and get behind it, or put your weapon away to avoid a large moving fire beam. If it does a quick 360 with a head whip and lightning surrounds its horns, avoid the subsequent lightning strikes by moving towards Alatreon. All of these attacks are great opportunities for damage, as for the full duration of the attacks, Alatreon is completely vulnerable. It can also perform a dragon dive at you, but this is less common. Alatreon has a dragon-empowered slam that will also pin you, and you never want to get pinned by Alatreon. It usually follows up and will target a single player very often. Watch for the rather quick hind leg rear up and move to the sides. There is a run attack that almost always strikes twice. If it runs away while imbued with dragon, expect it to come back just as fast. Whenever Alatreon switches into dragon form, it will charge a deadly dragon blast attack. If you can dodge it with evade window, this is a fantastic chance for damage. There are 2 versions of this. If Alatreon stands up almost immediately and stays that way, the strike happens a second after it lands back down. If it only does a small hop, the strike will happen on the second large hop that it does. This blast almost always happens on the transition into dragon form, where the former happens if it is already in dragon form. If Alatreon holds up one foot while charging an ice beam, move away to avoid the following ice field. The same attack but in a fire form will happen when it's flying, but you shouldn't need to worry about that often, as when Alatreon flies, there really isn't much you can do as a melee user. Your best bet is to wait out the flying if it's enraged, or slam it down if not enraged. If you can't get the slam in the air, try flashing it when not enraged and following up with a slam. Speaking of slams, there are only 3 locations where a slam works, all marked by these large double rocks. These rocks have ridiculously bad hit detection, so make sure you are lined up properly or you'll most likely miss. Trying to get the hit from the side usually ends in failure. While Alatreon is flying, it has a host of various ranged attacks, and while I could go through all of them, it pretty much comes down to one thing. You're not safe anywhere. Far-reaching attacks, triple slams that target one player, and 2 different circular beams mean no matter what distance you're at, you are not safe. Try to avoid the oil Alatreon spits, as subsequent fire attacks will ignite them. Ice chunks will drop during this duration of this phase, but are easily avoided as there is a dragon effect and falling ice particles where they will land. Pay attention, keep your weapon away, and just ride it out, unless you're gunning, in which case you're the only one who can deal damage to it during this phase. While I rarely find it necessary to do damage during this phase, it is incredibly helpful. Try to stay at mid-range, and if you see it charge up an attack, roll underneath. Its trickiest attacks are a water or fire beam shot in a circle. It's obvious to tell because Alatreon will rear while flying, and you can see either water or fire charge from its mouth. Get in close quickly to avoid this attack. Alatreon is a very difficult fight, and it can seem like there's a lot to manage, but the most important thing is to get the elemental damage checks and topple Alatreon over, allowing you to survive Eschaton Judgment. If you can't reliably break the horns, switch off of a fire or ice weapon and use a thunder, water, or dragon weapon while focusing on the front legs. You'll get more consistent damage this way, allowing you to meet the damage checks. This quest is more of an outright elemental damage push. The more you can do, the better. Augment your weapons accordingly, learn Alatreon's attacks, and though you should play it safe, do your best to attack relentlessly, and even if you don't break the horns, you'll get a victory.